In the early hours of January 14th, 2018, a scared 17-year-old girl climbed out of the window of her house and ran. Through shaky hands, she used the old cell phone that she had with her to dial 911. She had never spoken to a stranger before, so when the police showed up, she had to put her fear aside and convince him that the story she was about to tell him was the truth. I'm Reagan Snyder, and this is the story of the Turpin family. On October 17, 1961, David Turpin was born in West Virginia to Betty and James Turpin, and by all accounts, he had a normal Christian upbringing. In high school, people would describe him as a nerdy homebody. He was part of the Bible club, the chess club, the science club, and he sang in the a cappella choir. After graduating from high school, he attended college at Virginia Tech, and he graduated with a degree in computer engineering. Louise Robinette was one of 6 children, and like David, she was raised as an evangelical Christian. Her dad was a preacher, and her mom worked as a cashier at Walmart. And in her family, her parents argued often, but Louise was very soft-spoken and sweet, and she was protective of her siblings, and so she tended to be the one to calm them down when their parents argued. When Louise was 15, she started dating David, who at 21 years old was 6 years older than her. And one day he showed up to her school, and he convinced the staff to let him sign her out, and off they went to go get married. They were gonna elope. They made it all the way from West Virginia to Texas together before they got stopped by police, and Louise, who was a minor, was taken back home. But instead of grounding her for life, Louise's parents were fine with her marrying David. They consented to it because they liked him. They liked that he was a Christian man. He was a Christian man. But they wanted them to have a proper wedding. They wanted to be in attendance, and they wanted to support them. So on February 11th, 1985, David and Louise exchanged vows in front of their families in a small, intimate ceremony. And once again, they set off for the sunset in Texas, and they would begin their life together. After moving to Texas, Louise distanced herself from her parents and her siblings. 2 years after she married David and moved to Texas, her dad stopped preaching and her parents separated. And then in 1988, Louise gave birth to their first child, a baby girl they named Jennifer. In 1990, when Jennifer was 2, the family of 3 moved into a beautiful home in Fort Worth, Texas, and David worked as a software engineer at General Atomics. He was making pretty good money by now, and Louise hadn't grown up with much. Her family was kind of poor when she was growing up, and she was proud that her mans was making some money. And she wanted to show it off and flaunt it a little bit. And so she was kind of back and forth with letting her family in and then cutting them out. But at this time, she was on speaking terms with them. And so she and David invited them out from West Virginia to come stay at their house. And they offered to pay for everything. They're going to pay for airfare and food and whatever other travel expenses there would be to get them out there to stay and have a good time. And this would end up turning into an annual tradition for them. In 1991, Louise gave birth to their second child. This time it was a baby boy. And around this time, they would run into some financial troubles. David made a yearly salary back then of $140,000, but Louise had a shopping addiction, and she ran up some significant credit card debt. In order to hide their financial troubles from her family, Louise continued to pay for her family to come visit them, thus running up the credit card bill just that much more. But it was important to her to maintain this perfect facade. In 1993, Louise had their third child, another little girl, and then the following year, in 1994, their first baby, Jennifer, was school age, so she started school at the nearby public elementary school. And to the people that Jennifer saw daily at school, her friends, peers, teachers, staff, she was showing some serious signs of neglect. She would show up to school with the same dirty clothes. She always wore this purple outfit, and it was always dirty. Her hair was always dirty and greasy and tangled and unbrushed. And teachers are mandated reporters. They are required to report any type of abuse or neglect that they might see in their students or in a child, but nobody ever said anything about it. They just kind of let it slide. So another year goes by, it's 1995, and Louise brings their fourth child into the world, another boy. The following year, in 1996, the Turpin family went to go visit Louise's family in West Virginia, and her sister Elizabeth came back with them to spend the summer with them in Texas. And on the way back, they stopped off at a casino in Louisiana, and Louise is like, hey, can you watch the kids? Me and David are going to go do a little gambling. And Elizabeth is like, what? This is weird, first of all. And second of all, this is not like you. What the heck are you asking me to do right now? Louise had always been this soft-spoken girl, a little bit rigid in her faith. And so Elizabeth is shocked and kind of weirded out. And at one point during this trip, Louise and David got into a fight in front of Elizabeth because he accused her of being a gambling addict. And so Elizabeth was like, okay, I see what happens. This perfect family is not so perfect after all. David was very controlling of the kids. They would get into trouble if they didn't ask permission to do normal things like eat or drink or go to the bathroom. They had to ask permission. After the summer ended and Jennifer went back to school, there was no improvement in her hygiene. She was still showing up in dirty clothes with tingly hair, and she started making these remarks that suggested abuse, and the teachers were starting to catch on. They're like, oh, I don't think we can ignore this anymore. So she was sent to the principal's office to discuss what was going on at home, but ultimately nothing came of it. And back at home, she would go home and there was just no affection from her parents. David and Louise never showed any affection to the kids, yet they kept having them. In 1997, their fifth child was born, another girl, and Louise's gambling habit continued. The shopping addiction continued. Nothing was getting better. The debt was growing, but so was their family, because in 1998, Louise gave birth to another little girl who would be their sixth child. So they've got a lot of debt and a lot of kids. After Jennifer finished third grade, she never went back to school. Her parents pulled her out, and none of the other Turpin kids would ever step foot in school. Whenever the kids' school life got brought up by other people, David and Louise just told them that they were homeschooling. In 1998, that year that they had had their sixth child, their debt got so bad that their house went into foreclosure, and they moved away from Fort Worth into the small town of Rio Vista, Texas, and into this kind of isolated house. It sounds like they had a fairly big property. And they didn't live there long before the house had just absolutely been turned into a disgusting, filthy pit. It smelled bad. There was dirt and grime caked on the floors and the walls. There were scratches on the insides of the doors and on the walls. There were brown, suspicious brown stains everywhere. There was mold in the showers, feces rubbed into the carpets. It was disgusting. While they were living there, they decided that they still didn't have enough kids. And so in 1999, Louise gave birth to another baby girl. So it brings them to 7 children now. And in the years following, we're just going to knock them out right now. They had a kid in 2001, 2003, 2004, 2006, and 2007, which brought their tally up to 12 kids. Louise cut off contact again with most of her family in West Virginia, and she didn't allow them to come visit her at their home in Rio Vista, probably because it was disgusting. But she would video chat with her sister Teresa, and Teresa noticed that they were very strict with their kids, and the kids they're really quiet and they're kind of withdrawn, but she just thought it was because they were being homeschooled, so they didn't have a ton of outside interaction with other kids and social and stuff, so they're just kind of quiet and awkward, socially awkward. But little did Teresa know that behind closed doors, these kids were being abused. If they didn't ask for permission for something, they would be slapped, choked, and beat. They were not, get this, they were not allowed to shower more than one time a year. What's the point? Kids are dirty within half a day. They were hardly fed. They were allowed to eat one time a day. And when they did eat, they were given cheap processed food with like no nutrients to it. Things like frozen burritos or bologna sandwiches, and it was never enough to fill them up. But they weren't allowed to ask for more food. If they did, they were beaten with belts or they were slammed into the wall by their parents. So naturally, they were incredibly malnourished, and because of this, they all looked younger than they actually were. They were really small and skinny, and they just were not growing properly because of this. There were times that the kids were so hungry that they would try to satiate their hunger by eating ice chips or whatever condiments were around, like ketchup or mustard. But David and Louise, oh, they made sure to eat real good. They would bring home cakes and pies and donuts and fast food and things that looked so good to the kids that, they're starving. They want anything at this point. And they would eat it in front of them, but they would never let them have any. It's like they got some sick pleasure from taunting these poor kids, their own flesh and blood. Not only were these kids malnourished, but the lack of normal socialization and the abuse that they had to endure led to delayed development and limited vocabulary and speech skills. To further isolate the kids, they moved into a trailer that they had parked on their property in Rio Vista. And the house was so trashed that it wasn't even livable anymore. It was moldy and grimy and dirty. There were mounds and piles of trash everywhere. There was moldy food. There was dead rats in there. This was Hotel California for rats. At some point, David and Louise abandoned their kids altogether for a while and left them alone in this trailer. And they would go out and stay in motels and all across the county, I think, or even the state, and just have these fun, wild adventures together while their poor kids are being completely neglected. They're starving. Occasionally, they would drop off a few groceries to the kids, but it was never enough. And then they'd go back out to partying and doing whatever they're doing. And so the kids would go through those groceries pretty quickly between the 12 of them. And then they would turn to eating grass and leaves and whatever they had access to just to kind of try to soothe their hunger pangs. Police had come to their house a few times, but it was never because of this situation. Nobody knew that this was going on outside of the family. The police came once because one of the kids had been bitten by a neighbor's dog, I guess, and another time because they had a pet pig, and the pig got out and ate a ton of the neighbor's dog food, like pounds and pounds of it, like 50 pounds or something like that is what I heard. So that's why the cops came. I don't know if they ever saw all the kids or the state of their living situation, but nothing came of it. There was no help there. In 2008, Louise told her sister Teresa that she and David were no longer Christian. They wanted to go out and really explore the world and experience what the world had to offer them. And this wasn't just a slight shift in their lives. This wasn't like hey, we don't believe in religion or we don't like this faith anymore. It was balls to the wall. We're going to go out and be crazy and do everything we can. They looked into Satanism and they started swinging. And Louise became a heavy drinker. And they would meet other swingers online, and then they would meet up for relations, if you know what I mean. But it wasn't David so much as it was Louise who was doing this. But don't get me wrong, David was into it. He supported it. He was into it. He was cool with his wife sleeping with strangers. In fact, he would drive her to these meetups and hotels or just wherever they're meeting, and he would just sit out in his car and wait there until she came out. It was all done. Whenever David and Louise felt like doing hood rat stuff with their friends, whatever they're getting into, they would just leave the older kids to babysit the younger kids at home. Their neighbors didn't really know what was going on, but they weren't completely in the dark about the state of their house because, they knew that the house smelled awful. Somehow they knew that maybe somebody had seen that there were ropes tied to the kids' beds, which is suspicious. There was trash everywhere. They saw how gross the house was, but nobody reported anything to the police. A couple years go by, and in 2010, the Turpin family moves to Murrieta, California, which is Southern California. And Louise got really into posting on Facebook. And, she's all about making sure that the family looks good and perfect, keeping up the facade. And so and a lot of people do this, right? We post our highlights to social media. Well, that was Louise. She was posting all the highlights, even though it couldn't be further from the truth. They went to Disneyland sometimes, and all the kids would be in matching outfits. And based on the photos that she posted on social media, they looked like a perfectly functional, happy family. It was after this move to California that Louise went no contact again with her family back in West Virginia. And they were trying to keep contact with the kids, but Louise wouldn't allow it. So to keep her family at bay, she would send them these happy pictures of the kids. Everybody's smiling, we're all good, everybody's great, to reassure the family that everybody was fine and everything was great. They did notice that the kids looked a little bit thin in the pictures, but otherwise, nothing seemed amiss. And I don't know if they must have not been so skinny at that point. I don't know, but that is something they noticed. David and Louise still didn't allow the kids to go to school, and to keep the state or the county from snooping around, they registered as a private school with the county. They named it the Sandcastle Day School, and David was listed as the principal and Louise was listed as the teacher. And all they had to do really was complete this affidavit for the Department of Education saying that all their kids were enrolled at their private school, and then that was it. The state had to stay out of it because technically it was a private school and they had no say in any of it. In 2014, they moved from Murrieta to Paris, California, which is about 20 minutes more inland from Murrieta. And the neighborhood was quiet. It was a nice neighborhood. It all looked normal. All the houses looked happy on the outside. Nobody could have known that inside the Turpin's home was a filthy hoarder's delight with abused and emaciated children. In 2015, they decided they're going to have another baby. So this brought them to a grand total of 13 children. They're like, we're really good parents. We're going to keep having kids. 2015 was the same year as David and Louise's 30th wedding anniversary, and they wanted to celebrate. So they took all the kids to Vegas in matching dresses and clothes, and they had a vow renewal at an Elvis chapel. And there's footage of it if you want to find it. The kids were excited to be out of the house because they never left the house. They never got fresh air. They never saw new faces or went to new places. So they're excited to be out of the house, especially in a new state. But they're sad inside. They're sad that this is all a facade, that this is fake. This is not their real life. Their lives were not what they looked to be to other people. And so a big question here on the outside, right, is why were these kids allowing this? Some of them are adults now. Why are they allowing this? Why don't they just run away? Well, it's easier said than done. The way that David and Louise kept their kids in line with what they wanted them to do and made sure that they behaved in public was by threatening them with CPS. But they made CPS out to be terrible, like the worst thing ever. They told them that if they did or said anything out of line, they would never see their family again. They would be all taken to different countries, and they would be put into cages, and they'd be starved until they're 18, and then they'd be kicked out into the world on their own, and they'd never see each other again. And that's devastating, to never see your family again. Even though these parents are awful, they're still their parents, and I think they had kind of an inherent love for them. But they also loved their siblings. 13 of them. They were all in the same position. They were all going through this together. That forges a bond that people don't really have otherwise. And so the idea of never seeing their siblings again was terrifying. And so they didn't say anything. They just went along with it and did what their parents told them to. And Louise would always speak for them. They always stayed quiet and reserved. Louise's gambling and shopping addiction still wasn't any better at this point. It's 2015 at this point. And David ended up having to file for bankruptcy. And her shopping addiction was weird because she would buy and hoard toys and kids' games and kids' clothing, but the kids were not allowed to touch any of it. I think Jennifer said they had like 100 special edition Monopoly sets. She would just spend money on weird stuff. It would all just sit in piles and collect dust in its packaging. It wasn't even being used. The kids' lives were spent confined to their dirty bedrooms, which they shared with like 3 or 4 at least of their other siblings. And sometimes they would be chained up for months at a time. A couple of the oldest kids were trusted enough to be given cell phones so that if David and Louise were out of the house, they could call them and give them instructions. One of the girls, Jordan, who was about 15 at this time, got a hold of one of the phones and just started browsing the internet. It was all very new to her, and she came across some Justin Bieber music videos and interviews, and the YouTube rabbit hole. You click one, and then this next one looks interesting, and pretty soon you've consumed all the Justin Bieber videos there are to consume, and that was her. And something about him and what he was saying really struck her. She had this moment of clarity where she realized that there was a big old world out there and she was missing out on all of it. And she didn't want to anymore. She wanted to go out and explore and see what the world had for her. She started to post videos to social media of her singing. And one day somebody commented asking why she was always inside. And she responded by explaining the rules of the house and of the family, and they're not allowed to go outside, they have to do this, and it's this way. And whoever had commented responded, and they're like, that's not right. And Jordan's like, I thought it wasn't right. She had been conditioned to believe that all of this was normal, but in her gut she knew it was not right. It wasn't normal, but it's all she knew. So she needed somebody to validate that feeling she had for her before she could kind of move on it. One of the siblings ended up snitching on Jordan and telling Louise that she had been using the phone while she was out of the house. They obviously don't know that snitches get stitches. So Louise is pissed off that Jordan's been using this phone, and she choked her. Louise choked her own daughter. And after this, Jordan started to have these terrible nightmares all the time. And she finally was like, I need to get out of here. I can't live like this anymore. I need to step up. I gotta save my siblings. We need to escape. So she confided in Jennifer, who was the oldest, and was now 29 years old, a full-grown adult. And they came up with a plan together. Jordan was going to sneak out of the window one night, and she was going to take one of the phones so that she could call 911. In preparing for this moment, Jennifer, who was the only one who had ever had somewhat of a life outside of the house when she was in public school all those years ago in elementary school, she told Jordan bits and pieces of everything that she knew. She just tried to compile everything and just tell her what she knew. And she tried to draw a map of the neighborhood to help Jordan know which way to go to get out onto a main road and escape. But one night during their planning phase, they overheard David and Louise talking about how they were going to be moving to Oklahoma, like soon, really soon. And for whatever reason, this meant that they would be chaining up all the kids. So Jennifer and Jordan were like, if we're going to do this, it's now or never. So in the very early hours of January 14th, 2018, Jordan took an old cell phone and she climbed out the window and she ran, just as she'd planned. And she's terrified. She was literally shaking. She was afraid that her parents were going to catch her and kill her. And so she's trying to dial 911, but her hands are shaking so badly that she's having a hard time doing it. She's standing in the street. She doesn't really know what sidewalks are, and that's how inside they were all the time, how limited their knowledge was. So she's standing in the street. Through shaking hands, she's able to finally dial and call 911. And this poor girl, who's so limited in her vocabulary and experience with talking to strangers, was basically word vomiting, trying to convey to the dispatcher what was going on and why she was calling, and basically tell her, hey, I need help. This is what's going on. Please send help. My parents are going to catch me. I'm scared. Deputy Anthony Kalachi was at the end of his shift, and he decided to be the one to respond to Jordan's call, because he's just thinking, this isn't just another case of a runaway. It's going to end with him taking her back home. That's usually how it does. It'll be a good way to end his shift. When he showed up, Jordan began explaining the situation to him the best she could, but he really didn't know what to believe or make of what she was saying. It was just kind of this very disjointed story, and he was very, very nice to her, but he's kind of like, what do I do with this? It was when Jordan told him that 2 of her sisters were currently chained to their beds and had been for the last 15 days for going through their mom's candy stash, that his ears kind of perked up, and he's like, uh-oh, maybe there is something to what she's saying. And he's like, well, do you have pictures of this? And she's like, yes, I have pictures. Before she left, when she was still in the planning stages of this escape, she recalled an episode of Cops that she had caught once. I think maybe her brother was watching it, and she remembered that in the episode they talked about evidence. And that's how she learned about evidence and what that was. And so before she escaped the house through the window, she had the foresight to take pictures that she could show to the police as evidence that she was telling them the truth, because she's terrified of being taken back. They had been failed so many times. So this changes everything, right? In an instant for Deputy Kalachi. And so he's like, come with me. He helps her into his car, and he called for backup. And less than 2 hours later, there were several officers walking up to the Turpin residence and knocking on the door. And they stood there and they knocked for over 2 minutes, thinking, okay, they're not going to answer. But then Louise and David both peeked their heads out, and they're like, what's up? What's going on? Well, because there were children potentially in harm's way, the police didn't need a search warrant. And they were very nice to the Turpins, and they just said, hey, we got a call. We just need to come in and make sure everybody's okay. So they come into the house, and they're smacked in the face with the smell. It's stifling hot, which is making that smell worse. They see the mountains and piles and mounds of trash and moldy food everywhere. And they start searching the house to see who's in there. And inside one of the bedrooms, which was the one that Jordan had been staying in, where she escaped from, they found 2 little emaciated girls, completely caked and covered in dirt. They had bruises on them, and they were just quietly sitting on the mattresses, just completely withdrawn and trying not to make anybody mad. To move forward with taking the kids from the house, they're going to have to find these chains. And so they're looking around, trying to find them. They're still kind of searching the house, and they found a bedroom that they almost missed. Some boxes were stacked up, and behind those was a door. So they go in there, and they find a boy who currently was and had been chained to his bed for weeks. And then after that, another officer found the chains that Jordan had been talking about. So it took them a minute to come to the door because they're unchaining the girls and trying to hide them, but they found them in the closet. So David and Luis were put into handcuffs right then and there, and they were walked out of the house and put into the police car. All of the kids were taken to the hospital, and Jennifer, who is the oldest at 29 years old, weighed 82 pounds. Some of the hospital staff had to excuse themselves and cry because these kids were and they were just in such bad shape. Some of them were on the brink of death. Due to their malnourishment, they were suffering from stunted growth, heart damage, they had difficulty walking, they had limited language and speech from the isolation and the neglect, they suffered nerve damage. I mean, just so many things. They weren't allowed to go to sleep until 4 or 5 every morning. They were forced to stay awake. None of them had seen a doctor in like 4 or 5 years, and none of them had ever been to the dentist, even once. They learned that these kids had been locked in dog kennels and homemade cages with padlocks, and if they ever did or said something wrong, one little thing, they would be beaten until they bled. David and Louise used the Bible to justify their behavior. They especially liked to quote verses out of Deuteronomy. Hospital staff and officials wanted to make sure that these kids knew that they were safe now. They wanted them to know that there are caring people in the world. They showed them love and warmth. They were given food and fresh, clean, comfortable clothes to wear. The only one out of the 13 kids who had not been abused was the youngest, the 2-year-old. And that makes me wonder when the abuse started for the other kids. I wonder if, when they were kids, they left them alone until they hit a certain age. 4 days after the Turpin children were removed from the home, David and Louise were each charged with the following: 12 counts of torture, 12 counts of abuse of a dependent adult, 6 counts of child abuse and neglect, and 12 counts of false imprisonment. David was also charged with 1 count of lewd act against a minor under 14. Their bail was set at $9 million, and they were not allowed to contact their kids directly for 3 years. If they wanted to communicate with them, they had to go through an attorney. And the evidence that was found in the home was enough to take them to trial. But on February 22nd of 2019, David and Louise made the decision to avoid trial by pleading guilty. In court, some of the kids weren't there. They just sent in statements to their parents to be read to them, which included statements of forgiveness. And some of the kids did show up to look them in the eye to make their statements. And upon hearing all of these, David sobbed. He had to have his attorney read his statement for him, which said, quote, "I never intended for any harm to come to my children. I'm sorry if I've done anything to cause them harm. I love my children and believe my children love me. I hope the very best for my children in the future." End quote. Louise's statement, which she read herself, said, quote, "I'm sorry for everything I've done to hurt my children. I love my children so much. I look forward to the day I can see them, hug them, and tell them I'm sorry." End quote. Louise's attorney tried to get her off the hook by using her diagnosis of histrionic personality disorder as a defense. Histrionic personality disorder is a psychiatric disorder that's marked by a pattern of attention-seeking behaviors. People with this disorder always want to be the center of attention. They're manipulative, they're sexually provocative, and Louise's sister, Teresa, was astounded when she found out what they'd been doing to the kids. She was just so surprised by it, but she wondered if Louise's behavior was a result of being sexually abused by their grandfather when she was a child. I guess her and her sister and her cousin were all sexually abused, but the judge rejected this mental illness angle. And at the age of 59 and 52, David and Louise Turpin were sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 25 years. Jennifer and Jordan are the two of the Turpin children who have kind of stepped up and spoken out about their experience. And they aren't speaking on behalf or for their siblings. They're just speaking to their own experience, and they're protective of their siblings. The other siblings, want to maintain their privacy. They're not ready to be in the public eye. So Jennifer and Jordan are the two who've kind of stepped up to get word out about what's going on and do interviews and talk about it. And sadly, some of the Turpin kids' nightmare was not over yet. 6 of the younger kids were placed into a foster home where they were physically and sexually abused. It's like even worse than what they thought they were safe, and then they weren't. And I'm not going to get into it, but it's awful. Several nonprofit agencies, including one that was founded by J.C. DeGard. Do you remember her? She had been abducted at 11 years old and held captive for 18 years. They raised a substantial amount of money on the Turpin kids' behalf, but they're so limited in their life skills and how to use money, how to just everything you need to know to be successful in life. They're so behind on. So that's another thing that they're having to work through. But Jordan is now 22 and she graduated high school in a year. She loves learning. She aspires to become a motivational speaker. She's very active on TikTok and she does some modeling. And Jennifer is an aspiring nurse, and they both care about people. They want to help people. 3 of the Turpin kids are taking college courses, and several of the younger siblings are still in foster care. And David and Louise are serving their sentences in separate California prisons. After the story had broke about the Turpin family, there was a guy who's now a doctor who recalled being in the same class as Jennifer Turpin when they were in elementary school. And he wrote a post on his Facebook about her and how she was the cootie kid in their class. And she would show up to school in the same outfit that looked like it had been dragged through the mud. She smelled bad. The kids would make fun of her for it. After he read this story and found out what had been happening to her, he was hit with this overwhelming sense of guilt and shame because I guess he took part in it too. He was just, he's a little kid and just doing what his peers are doing and feeling guilty that, he's going home to love and a warm meal at night and being tucked in by his parents while this poor girl was being neglected and abused by hers. He said, quote, Jennifer, despite being vehemently vilified by her peers, was still one of the most pleasant people I have had the opportunity to meet. She had this whimsical optimism to her that couldn't be dampened, couldn't be doused, no matter what anybody threw at her. That cheerful disposition is what makes me certain that Jennifer will prevail. Despite being let down by her parents and by her peers alike, Jennifer rose above it all. The resounding lesson here is a simple one. Something that we're taught from the very beginning. Be nice. Teach your children to be nice. Befriend the Jennifer Turpins of the world. Thank you so much for being here. If you enjoyed this episode, click the follow button and leave me a shining review if you would. I also just started a YouTube channel with shorter form true stories. If you're into that, I'll leave a link in the description if you're interested in checking that out. If you want to get a hold of me or see what I'm up to in between stories, you can follow me on Instagram at @thestoryofpod. Send me a message. Have a fantastic week, and I will see you next time.